I'm out today on some small local rivers to see if I could find any fish feeding. We've recently had a lot of rainfall and as you can see, conditions are terrible. The river was up and really coloured, and I'd never fished this spot before, but as you can see there's a really interesting join in the rivers where this inlet meets it. Having never fished this spot before, I started by doing something called plumbing the depth. This allows you to get a very accurate reading of how deep a certain stretch of river or lake is. A plummet is one of the cheapest pieces of fishing tackle you can buy, and if you want to float fish effectively, it's very important that you own one. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes now, but they all do the same job, having a solid top and a soft piece of cork or foam on the bottom. They're very simple to use, but for anyone who hasn't used one before, you place your hook through the ring at the top of the plummet. One small tip I like to do is wrap my line around and then put it through again. The benefit of doing this is that it ensures that if your hook were to become detached from the foam or the cork at the bottom, the pressure of this added loop means that your plummet won't fall off. Once you've passed your line through, you pull the hook down towards the bottom. Not every plummet will have this notch running along the edge, but the process is still the same. With a hook firmly secured into the bottom of your plummet, you should be able to let go with it securely hanging on the line. As you now lower your plummet slowly through the water, you'll be able to feel it touch the bottom. What this will then do is allow you to move your float up and down the line depending on how deep you're currently set. Here you can see me lowering the plummet through the water. At this point you need to pay careful attention to the float. With the float disappearing under the water, this tells me that I'm not fishing deep enough, so I have to move the float up the line. Instead of just doing this once, it's good to do it 2 or 3 times to get an accurate reading of how far you think you need to move the float. To fish deeper in the water, you need to move the float away from the hook. If you were to drop the plummet down and the hook is above the water, you simply move the float towards the hook, fishing shallower. It might take 2 or 3 goes to get the depth spot on, but it's worth doing. Now, as I lower the plummet down, you'll see the float just touch the surface before the plummet hits the bottom. It would be easy at this stage just to start fishing, but what I like to do is move the float a little bit closer towards me, and this helps me map out the areas around. As you can see here, more of the float is sticking out the water. If I bring it closer still, even more of the float sticking out. If I lower the plummet a little bit further out in the swim, the float starts to disappear. And again, just a few inches and the float has disappeared completely. This tells me that the bottom of the river slopes away from me, and that I'm not currently fishing in the deepest channel in the middle. Continue adjusting as necessary until you're fishing at the exact depth that you want to. One thing I like to do at this point is to make a mental note of exactly how deep the swim is. To do this, I place the hook in the very bottom of the rod, or if you have a hook ring you can use this. Slowly tighten your line and have a look at where the very tip of the float is. Now make a mental note by counting how far up or down from the end of the rod your float is. Doing this now means that if your float were to accidentally slide up or down the line, or if you break off, you don't have to go through the whole process of plumbing the depth again, because you know exactly how far from the end of your rod is to the very tip of the float. On this occasion, I can see that the float ends at the bottom of the whipping on the second eye. Once my depth is accurately set, I have a little walk along the swim and just plumb along just to see that there are no deeper depressions or that it doesn't shallow up at all. Happy with my depth and how the float's running through, it's time to get some bait in. I was going to be using a bait dropper as I was aiming to fish on the bottom. I was introducing a mixture of maggots and my sloppy corn ground bait mix. This gives them some nice food to keep them in the area, but also cloud up the swim, drawing fish from further down the river. I fished the swim for about half an hour, but without any real solid bites or any indications. It was clear that the conditions had really affected the chances of catching fish. Without wishing to waste too much time, I moved on to a different stretch, in the hopes that I could find an area a bit less coloured. I drove along a few areas of the same river and found it all in a similar state. I didn't want to leave without at least seeing if there was anything feeding, so I went through the same process. I checked the depth, I introduced a little bit of bait with the bait dropper, and decided I'd spend 15 minutes running a float through. It quickly became apparent that this river, looking more like gravy, wasn't going to give up any of its inhabitants. With one last roll of the dice, I decided to go to a completely different river closer to home. On arrival, this looked a much better prospect. I began in the top swim and introduced some bait by hand. With this river being much shallower, it's okay to loose feed by hand, and it wasn't necessary to use the bait dropper. I started to see a few swirls where there were fish going for the maggots running through the water. I assumed they were chub and kept the float running through. On the third or fourth run down, the float buried and I was into a fish. A clever robin decided it was also time for a feed and came to take some dropped bait while my back was turned. As the fish surrendered, I could see it was a lovely trout. Having worked hard for this fish, I at least wanted to give it its moment in front of the camera. I could see the fish was milting, so I put it straight back. With the likelihood that there would be more out-of-season trout in the swim, I decided to move on and explore different areas. I made my way down to this lovely swim, which contained some fast-flowing water. Hoping that there would be some chub or some silvers in here, I introduced a bit of bait. I was glad I'd made the effort to come to this river, as I quickly received another bite in this next swim. The fish held its weight in the faster flowing water and tried to shake the hook along the deeper far margin. With the fish starting to tire, I was glad to be catching, but as another trout came to the surface, it became apparent I'd need to target something else. Not wanting to mess around with it, this one went straight back to get on with its wintry business. With stretches of this river known for its carp population, I made my way down to a much more calmer section. I introduced some maggots and some of my sloppy mix under one of the nearside snags. I brought a separate rod with heavier line and I was fishing this one on a free running lead. These fish do get targeted a lot, and my idea with the free running lead was that they'd be a little bit more inclined to pick it up, with most anglers fishing fixed leads on a lead clip system. The hook length was about 10 inches of 8-pound fluorocarbon, and this was tied to a size 16 micro barbed beaked point hook. With a small bunch of maggots put directly onto the hook, it was a careful flick towards the snag. I'd barely placed the rod down when I noticed out the corner of my eye the rod tip flick. I assumed I'd knocked the rod, but looking down I was nowhere near it. This was a good indication that there were some fish in the area. With expectations now running high, I bent down to extend my net with the hopes that I would catch a fish. In typical timing as carp do, my rod decided to pull round. Thankfully my strike wasn't met with any resistance, so I didn't spook anything. I couldn't tell if they were just liners or if they were fish feeding on the bait. With the maggot still looking fresh, it was another underarm flick back into the same position. The fish were clearly not disturbed, as I'd barely put the rod down before it was pulling around again. Having these indications, I decided to hold the rod to see if I could feel for a bite, but I decided against it, with the risk of moving the lead or the hook bait and spooking anything that was down there. A few more minutes of watching the line twitching, I had to resist striking at anything with the risk of either foul hooking or spooking what was down there. It wasn't long, however, until I got a much better indication. Striking at the second one, I was in. The fish knew where it wanted to get, but with steady pressure I was able to coax it away from the snaggy area. Eventually, after hours of searching, walking and working, I had a prize in the net. After a brief struggle, I was finally able to hold my prize up for the camera. I felt like I'd really earned this one. Returning the ghostie back to its home, I was able to reflect on what ended up a really successful day. I aim to come back and target the carp specifically on this river. Feel free to subscribe and stay updated with my sessions.